Hi, everyone. Happy New Year and welcome to On the Agenda. There are $120 trillion in payments flows that move between businesses annually. $10 trillion of those flows move cross-border. As a result, there is no shortage of perspectives about how to make them more efficient and less costly for buyers and suppliers, and no shortage of solutions that promise to deliver both and even more. On the agenda today is B2B cross-border payments, a conversation that will unpack this $10 trillion business payments prize, one that promises to offer new insights about the digital opportunity to make those cross-border payments flows faster and smarter, the things that perhaps you didn't know following a year of cross-border commerce challenges brought about by a global pandemic that unfortunately remains very much a part of our present. Three experts on this topic will guide our conversation today. Transformate CEO Sinead Fitzmaurice, Coupa EVP Ravi Thakur, and Wells Fargo Head of Global Product Management, Judd Hoyle-Rohde. Hi all, thanks for joining me today and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Karen. Delighted to be with you.
So happy that we're starting the new year talking about such an important conversation and one that has so much potential, but unfortunately so much friction still attached to it today. So I kind of built this discussion up a lot in my opening. So I hope you guys are all up for it. Like I did promise, things you didn't know, new insights. So Ravi, I'm going to put you on the hot seat. Since I did that build up, what are we going to tell our audience today about cross-border business payments and the digital opportunity that perhaps they haven't heard before?
Yeah, well, Karen, first off, thanks for having me on the panel, and great to have Sinead and Judd and sharing the stage with you here today. You know, when we look at cross-border payments, we think of cross-border payments as a super important, super critical part of the equation, right? Part of the broader payments equation. And when we talk to our customers and we talk to industry, we talk to Wall Street, payments is a key part, but it's really looking at the bigger picture of digitization, automation of the entire supply chain. And so it's looking at how are you managing your invoices? How are you managing your purchase orders? How are you managing your settlement with payments? And so a lot of the times when we get into these payment discussions with our customers, it's really unpacking the pain points around payments and realizing that a lot of it starts up front with invoice processing. A lot of it ends with their inability to engage with suppliers in a collaborative fashion. And so that's kind of what we're seeing. And that's where whenever we talk about payments, it seems to be missed in these conversations. And when talking to customers, it's helping them understand, helping these corporates understand it's a much bigger picture that payments is a part of that they need to be solving for.
So it's what happens before and after.
Absolutely.
What about you? What do you think people will walk away with after listening to us talk for the next 30 minutes or so that they didn't know before?
Well, I think you mentioned an astronomical number there, 125 trillion in cross-border payments. And like we perceive in Transformate that about 3% of that on cross-border B2B is actually digitalized. So despite the evolution of, the digitalized platforms like what Coupa are doing and the innovative products that our Wells Fargo are doing, the actual embedding of the payments infrastructure within those systems is still quite untapped. So we estimate about 97% of that is still, the traditional correspondent banking systems, the friction that go with that. And just to give you a bit of, I suppose, real life learning of how I founded the business. Transformate Global Payments was founded in 2010 by Terry Clune, who owns Clune Technology Group. And he specialized in a suite of financial services that helps businesses, I suppose, ease barriers when they're trading internationally, one of which was a VAT international reclaim business. So back in 1996, when the group was founded by Terry, the friction points of moving money around the world was very evident. So the unpredictability, when you have that decentralized section and system of payments outside of the core system, it's very difficult to track traceability, reconcilement, and so on. So we set about building Transformate, which was a significant infrastructure build, so probably 10 years in the making. We have payment licenses right around the world, specializing in B2B. But what that provides is, it breaks down the barriers for the parcel correspondent banking network. And when you embed that API within a system like Coupa Pay or Wells Fargo Global Invoice Connect, that provides very rich intelligence for companies that use it. And when you think of 97% of cross-border transactions are not digitalized and focus on the traditional correspondent banking network, which is decentralized, the amount of manual administration that's pumped into the system is enormous. So, the benefits and the value for businesses for centralizing, integrating, embedding the payments within the core platforms, and platforms like Coupa, and Wells Fargo, they've been trailblazers in terms of shining the spotlight on alternative payment methods to enhance the customer journey. So very excited about what lies ahead, but much work to be done.
Sounds like much work to be done. There's a lot of opportunity, also a big lift. 97% of 125 trillion is a lot of stuff, a lot of payment flows. Judd,
I think fintechs to date have, probably concentrated on the remittance and the consumer market. The B2B is quite untapped, and it's still quite, an area. CFOs, as the cloud accounting and the pay or source to pay platforms like Coupa Pay and so on have evolved, people want that last leg of the journey, which is the payment enriched in the platform.
Yeah, and I think it's because of all the things we just talked about, which is it's not just about the payment, it's about things that happen before and after. And that's
exactly,
really yeah. So Judd, I'm going to finish off this piece of the conversation by asking you. So, what are some of the things that you think need to be talked about and we'll have in this conversation that are often missed in other discussions about cross-border B2B?
Well, I think Ravi and Sinead set it up well. It's really about the packaging, right? I mean, we tend to talk about payments as some independent component, but it's that end-to-end sort of workflow and understanding of where the friction exists. So, I tend to look at the value of the payment in the context of the certainty, right? And certainly many companies also look at the velocity as an important aspect. Because the speed, which may not be as relevant in the B2B market, because you don't have the consumer level sensitivity to getting that payment maybe immediately. But the faster you get the payment, the faster you're closing out the transaction. So it brings that certainty to the whole package of experience. So I think, as Sinead said, a lot of it is how you sort of package everything together to understand the end-to-end value proposition and how you serve that customer need in the business format, and tying that closer to the core workflow operationally of what that company does, what they sell, what they distribute is a really, really important factor in the B2B space.
Yep. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about the end-to-end perspective and some of the interesting use cases in just a minute. But I want to go back to 2020. Not that any of us really want to relive 2020, but Sinead, I want to get your perspective on something. It is day 5, according to the calendar, up this new year. Business day 2 of the new year.
Yeah.
But it's hard to deny the fact that 2020, unlike a lot of years, past years, won't have a huge impact on what we do in 2021 and beyond. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the one thing that happened in 2020 with respect to your perspective on solving some of the cross-border payments issues and frictions that remain, that has changed your thinking, maybe even your approach to delivering solutions that solve for it.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, Karen, 2020 has been a dramatic year. It's been so many complexities. It's hard to kind of pick out one standalone moment. But I think as the globalization has been evolving to a digitalized era for payments, the COVID era has shone a spotlight on the need for digitalized payments, not only for companies that are suffering from a cash flow point of view, but also those that are surging from the supply chain demand.
Mhm.
So if you think of companies that, have suddenly, when they started out in 2020, they were fine, they had their plans, they were going to projection, and then only in March COVID hit, and like having information at your fingertips to adapt to that environment in a very, very fast is key, right? So from a cash flow point of view, if you've got a decentralized system outside of your core system, it's very difficult to pinpoint where your cash flow cycle is, both from an AR and AP point of view, but also if you're surging in demand. So there's been businesses that have surged in demand during COVID, not just focusing on the negative, but especially, getting payments to their suppliers on time, like what Coupa Pay does, but also for the Global Invoice Connect that Wells Fargo does. That's an export-driven product. So it's really kind of connecting the buyer and the supplier within the one platform. And I suppose the more decentralized the system and the traditional, the more difficult the information is in real time to get a hand of. And I think for me, the standout moment has been you need information at your fingertips that's very fast to make decisions very quickly, because it's a situation that is ever evolving in 2020, and it's still evolving, right? So the more kind of rich information that you have real time, the better.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Having access to information has always been important, but it's never been more critical. Particularly when it comes to the buyer supplier trading dynamics. I mean, Ravi and Jen, I want to get the perspective from the corporate side now.
Yeah.
Maybe take us inside some of the conversations you're having with clients and prospective clients about how this is influencing their roadmap.
Yeah, and the way that we've been seeing it when talking to customers, Sinead hit it on the spot, right? It's about information, it's about data, it's about the intelligence of the information. And when you think about these payment flows and digitizing, it's moving from having one set of information about who you're paying to a new set of information. And that's kind of the biggest takeaway for us in terms of what we've seen with their customers is, in a lot of our situations when they're coming to Coupa Pay with, leveraging our TransforMate way of money movement, a lot of the challenges that they're facing is a lot of data they have about their suppliers remit to information sitting in their ERP system. It's sitting in a legacy system. It's not very rich. It doesn't have the right level of information. A lot of it hasn't been used in quite some time. And so a big part of our efforts in working with customers is how do we better enable you to gather that information from your suppliers? How do we better gather the remit to information? How do we collect it? And how do we then provide it in a way within in our world, in the Coupa community, such that we can make that information more accessible to all of our customers, all of the Coupa buyers within the Coupa ecosystem? And so that to me is kind of the biggest takeaway in the sense that, we've always been automating the purchasing and invoicing flows. We've been automating the payment flows. But what we saw with COVID is obviously the move to digitalization, obviously a big push towards that. But then it's the collaboration. It's how do you get that information from your suppliers? How do you bring it into the system? How do you make sure that it's not fraudulent, and working through all of those mechanics?
Yeah, we're going to talk about fraud in a minute. But that really seems to be the theme with business payments, is this collaborative nature of the buyer-supplier dynamic now, and really working very diligently to enable that collaboration. Jed, what about you? When you think about some of the conversations you're having with corporates and the change in some of those conversations, perhaps last year to now, the start of the new year, what's on the agenda? What are some of the big milestones on the business payments roadmaps that you're talking about with your clients?
There are a few. I mean, I think I would certainly emphasize, like everybody else has, the emphasis towards digital, right? And removing and recognizing in the current environment, that the elements of manual intervention and human interaction need to, at the very least, in the interim, be worked around. one of the interesting things that's come out of that is, I think, conversations about a company's own ecosystem, right? To Ravi's point, where do the data points sit? Where do the points of origination for a payment sit, right? Traditionally, we've looked at it sort of very much in the context of an ERP or a treasury operation. But you look at APIs now and you look at how companies are really sort of reinvesting in their own digital vision. And part of that journey is to determine where the best place in places across their ecosystem is to embed some of those interactions around data, information, and payments. And so I certainly note that there's a lot more conversation in the business community about really localizing some of those investments in that innovation. So if you're an insurance company, when you're looking at sort of reimagining your claims process, can you actually originate the claim payment right at that point that the claim in the claim system is approved, right? Rather than creating a file, sending it over to Treasury, going through sort of that more traditional financial workflow. And I think that will continue, right? As companies recognize that they really have to perform and probably differentiate themselves in that type of manner to bring that digital value to their customers versus their competitors.
I want to stick with that for a minute and talk about use cases. So you mentioned insurance and claims, and it sounds as though the driver for some of these new use cases for digitizing business payments is to reimagine the process. Is that really what's happening, or is it also to just eliminate some of the big pain points? Is it that they need an aspirin to fix the pain point, or do they want the vitamin to strengthen and fortify, something they really want to achieve that's better?
I think it's a bit of both, right? I think there's that opportunity to achieve better velocity, better differentiation, better quality. But there's also the reality, right? When we're talking about cross-border, there's a lot of friction in both the way those payments are handled through the traditional mechanisms, right? You take lifting fees, for example. How do you anticipate lifting fees? The reality is you can't, right? So there's this break point between sort of the invoice amount and the paid amount that ultimately has to be dealt with. So when you start to look at things about like how do you embed sort of the workflows differently and fundamentally change the way that you structure those payments from a cross-border perspective to leverage some of the new schemes, right? I mean, this is one of the reasons when you look sort of in the core banking community, why organizations like Swift are focused on, the Swift Simple proposition and the Swift Instant proposition, because I think they recognize that to be relevant to the broader business community, they need to continue to adapt to reduce some of this type of friction and help the industry reduce that type of friction.
Ravi, where are you seeing some of the interesting use cases and what's driving them?
Yeah, and you phrase it, Karen, you phrase it in a good way about vitamin versus an aspirin. And I think that a lot of companies, especially larger corporates, everyone is aspiring to the vitamins, but the reality is everyone's downing 10 aspirins, right? They have so many pain points. We have customers with 100 different ERP systems, right? If you have 100 different ERP systems, the situation is not really about how to make the payment faster. It's how do I not get fired for sending the wrong payment to the wrong vendor, right? How do I manage across 50 different bank accounts to do cross-border payments across, 36 different countries? And so what we're seeing is that, look, at the end of the day, these companies, they need to get their processes in order. They need to have systems and solutions to help them go across the different back-end ERP systems such that they can start channeling funds through a single way, whether it be a single treasury system, a single banking integration, whatever it may be. And that's kind of really where we're seeing the challenges. When you look at smaller companies or younger companies that have had an opportunity to standardize early on, or have had the opportunity to grow a bit more organically, where they don't have multiple ERP systems, they're the ones that are taking the vitamins, right? Those are the ones that are looking at, okay, how do I cut my my remit to time from 5 days to 1 day? How do I gain better visibility? How do I have better reconciliation? And so it's really a little bit of both, as Judd was saying. It just really depends on where that client is and where that cut corporate is on their maturity level. That's kind of how we've been seeing it.
Sinead, where are you seeing some of the greatest interest in embedding payments into different workflows, maybe in different in different verticals? What seems to pop to the top of the list for you?
I think it's all of what I'm bringing it right, stripping it back down to basics, right, Garen? I think it's all of what Judd and Ravi has just said. Like, top of the agenda in every boardroom at the moment is cost cutting and cost rationalization, efficiencies. Where can we seek efficiencies? Where can we increase, risk mitigation? All of that. And I think what we're displaying today is when you embed that payment functionality, you cut out the costs, as Judd was saying, the sender fees, the receiving fees. You have much more rich interpretation of where the transaction is and the critical path. That all translates into real cost savings, right? So, like, what we've set out when we formed the business back in 2010 is to develop a network that partners could utilize to actually bring savings to their underlying customers. So, every single customer, every single corporate, be it small, medium, large, at the moment in the boardroom is talking about cost rationalization, efficiencies, risk mitigation, and so on. The more centralized you can make that and embed the payments within the critical path of the transaction, like the what we used to call in the old accounting age, the book of primary entry, which is the invoice. So what Global Invoice Connect is doing and what Coupa Pay is doing, embedding the payment transaction, be it collection for overseas, or actually producing the payment from the buyer to the supplier, that will all translate into cost reduction, be it administration burden lifting or actual real cost savings. And that's kind of, I suppose, what we're seeing as the key agenda on the top of all of the clients that we're looking at the moment. They're looking for ways where you can rationalize your costs, increase efficiencies, and make sure that transparency is key, because essentially work from home is everything at the moment, and the more visibility that they have on access control and so on is quite important as well.
And work from home may be a reality for a very long time, at least for part of the course, for part of the time. But okay, so there's this recognition now that something has to be done. And I think, one of the things that's come out of 2020 is that, the old, let's not worry about things that aren't broken, that kept, progress from being made. Well, it broke. And now there's the recognition that we need to fix it. But still, there are always considerations that get in the way of making decisions and progress from happening. What are some of the obstacles that remain that need to be overcome in order to realize some of the great potential that digitizing these flows, embedding the payments into workflows are facing? Judd, I'll start with you. What's holding progress back?
So I think part of it is the intersection between information and payments themselves, right? Fundamentally, we tend to think about them, in the context of parallel tracks where, functions like reconciliation ultimately bring them back together. Certainly in the US marketplace, you look at progress around things like ISO 222 and shifts that actually start to really bring a depth of information that travels with the payment and remains associated with that payment is fundamental, right? And there's a lot of, I think, of good work at the industry level and even the regulatory level to try and shepherd that type of change forward. But I think that's one of the more important transformations that's going to be required here. And it's going to take a lot of time and investment well across the broad financial ecosystem, right? Banks and corporates and small businesses alike to take advantage of that and to leverage the value and the scale that that context of bringing the payment and more depth of information together.
But it doesn't sound like, I mean, it's not that we don't have time, but if vital information is vital, and the imperative for wanting to make payments digital, smarter, and faster is apparent, what happens in the interim? Yes, we need standards, but we can't wait until we have a standard in order to make progress. So what should businesses do in the interim? How do they make progress?
Yeah, I would take a different tact on answering that, Karen, in the sense that, look, fintechs have come such a long way over the past 5-7 years, right? I mean, tremendous capabilities, APIs, you name it. A lot of the use cases are in the consumer world because consumers tend to be more, I mean, they're just more open. There's more consumers than businesses. But the reality is there's two aspects with corporates that happen that slow things down. One is just inertia within an organization. And so getting any project done, is dictated around change management. Is there a budget for it? Do you have an exec sponsor? All that kind of fun stuff that we all, know about. But then the second part is trust. And when I say that, it's really around, if I'm a large corporate, if I'm a Fortune 1000 or even a Fortune 2000, am I going to trust a small fintech to start moving money around? It's a difficult thing for a large corporate to get that buy-in within them to use a smaller fintech. But that's where, Wells Fargo comes into play by, bringing TransforMate into their global processes. That's where Coupa comes into play, where we have the trust of these large companies and bringing in these different processes. And so it's really around, as we start to get these things rolled out more within these large corporates and them getting to start to use it, that's when you'll see the next kind of level of innovation and next level of usage, because that's when you're going to get into the real, the heavier use cases around getting to that, 120 trillion, 10 trillion, whatever the number is, and starting to see more of that money move. Otherwise, it's going to be a long haul to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my sense is that, inertia may no longer be the obstacle, but I think it's making the right decision for how to, avoid having to take the 10 aspirins every day to navigate the business payments landscape. So, I mean, Judd, is that your role, helping corporate clients figure that part out?
Yeah. And I think, to Ravi's point, I think as a whole, the marketplace has to get away from this mindset of there's an either and an or, right? The reality is there's an and, right? So, and when I look at fintechs versus financial services, the reality is the co-opetition that those two marketplaces actually generate innovative partnerships between themselves that create that bridge to progress, right? Somewhat to Ravi's point. I would love to say, in 2022, we're going to realize the value of being an ISO-enabled world and everything's going to be perfect. That's not the case, right? We have to iterate in how we bring, sort of the reduction of friction and value to the marketplace in general. So I'm a big believer that these iterative and innovative partnerships, like we've done with TransforMate, to take the friction out of the cross-border invoicing process for customers, is exactly what the market needs to be doing as incremental steps to progress.
Mm-hmm. And Ravi, I would imagine you would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, when you think about the spectrum of faster or smarter, maybe do a self-assessment from the perspective of what's valued by corporates. Is there more of a value placed on faster or smarter payments? And how are we doing as an ecosystem in delivering both of those? Scale of 1 to 10. Ravi, I'm picking on you, Ravi, because
no, that's totally fine.
Because you're in the office. Really not.
I would say that probably between me, Judd, and Sinead, we probably have the vision at a 10. We all know what we want to do and how to get there. It's a matter of, timing to execute against that. And at the end of the day, you know, a large corporate, mid-sized corporate, whatever it may be, in a B2B payment scenario, you're either sending something domestically, you're sending it cross-border, you're paying by check, you're paying by card. You may want to take an early pay discount, or your supplier may be willing to take an early pay discount. Whatever it may be, there's so many moving pieces to this, and all of the information, the data that's there is all lending itself to how do you make that smarter payment? What's the best rail to use? What's the best discount for supplier to take in order to get the money faster? And so to me, it's really looking at, from a, fintech, from a, products that are out there in the world today, probably a 7 or an 8 in terms of the capabilities being there. But then when you try and bring those capabilities back into a corporate, that's where you get into the inertia piece, which, Karen, I disagree with you a little bit that inertia is still there, right? Meaning you have employees at home, just trying to make sure they're able to survive right now, right? Let alone worrying about work. And so switching out a payment system when, they have kids running around trying to do Zoom school, not necessarily the biggest thing that they want to do. And that's what I meant by the inertia aspect. There's a lot of stuff that needs to happen within these companies to feel the pain in order to make that move. But I would say, technology-wise, 7, 8 in terms of technology being there, but in a matter of, probably a 1 to 2 to really getting to smarter payments, really being out there within corporates.
Sinead, do you agree with that?
I'd probably not as brave as Ravi to put an actual number and score on it, Ravi. But suffice to say, I think the impact of digital platforms.
Come on. Give a number.
Impact of digital platforms, I think, has pushed the agenda, right? But I think there's a lot of way to go in terms of, and it really depends on the company, I think, Aaron, whether they favor faster or smarter. Some, as we go back to, what has happened in 2020, I mentioned earlier, where some businesses have surged in supply and demand, and they may need to get payments to their suppliers faster. So that's top of their agenda. But others may be under cash flow restrictions, so it's much more smarter intellect. But I think what we're all, Ravi, myself, and Judd are explaining is you've got that complete aggregated solution. You tick every box in terms of faster, the smarter, but it's a very complex environment, the B2B payments environment.
Yep.
When you say you set out to as Judd said, it's all about alternatives. To actually create an alternative to the traditional system takes significant amount of time. It takes years, Transmate set out in 2010. It's not a startup. It's been very focused on the infrastructure build first to bring that infrastructure to power dynamic partners like Coupa and Wells and so on, who are trailblazers in what they do as regards, they want to lead the way in digitalizing the payment capability, be it payment or receivables within the platform. And Transmate wants to be, I suppose, the intel inside in terms of powering that. So our concentration is on the regulation aspect, and Ravi touched quite rightly on the trust aspect and making sure that you deal with a regulated, worldwide partner and so on. And that's very important as well. But I think the agenda of the companies as regards faster or smarter really comes down to what is the pain point of that company at a particular point in time. And I think those pain points are much more prevalent now than they were in other years. Everybody has cash flow issues. Everybody has, needs to get payments to suppliers on time at the right amount. But I think COVID has shone a light on acute problems within the system. And if you can embed the rich data of the payment within the software, that ticks a lot of boxes in terms of everybody's pain points. So.
Judd, I want to ask you whether fraud comes up in any of the conversations that you have with corporates about moving payments faster. I mean, I know that has come out actually in some research the payments has done hasn't yet released that even though there's an appetite for onboarding real-time payments, there's a concern that, along with that comes fraud. I know that that's perception, perhaps not reality, but Does that come up in your conversations with corporates? And is fraud a problem with real-time payments?
I don't know if it's a problem. I think it's certainly a sensitivity to your point, right? And I think some of it is frankly the newness, and it's also frankly the intersection between real time settlement and irrevocability, right? And so you're presented with that as a business, and there's a certain nervousness that comes with that, right? That's moving so quickly, and I can't get it back if something goes wrong or I make a mistake, or if there is indeed fraud. When you look at the domestic real time schemes, a lot of the fraud that gets precipitated is primarily confidence based fraud, right? So I'd venture to say, it's not dramatically systemic. It's more that situation where, somebody's saying, if you pay me now, I'll give you the 2 concert tickets after the fact, right? There's no escrow involved in that's protecting, the fact that you actually get the tickets delivered that you paid for. So I'd venture to say that it's more of an orientation to the newness, right? I think it's a more of a consideration to the operating differences and the operating risks versus today's established traditional mechanisms. And frankly, just the newness of the real-time proposition rather than there being sort of a broad, fraud concern.
Sinead, does that come up in your conversations?
I think wherever you have money movement, you will have fraudsters, right? But to add to Judd's point, I think the more that you can close the loop, and I think what Judd was alluding to there, that the digital enhancement, if you have a one, I suppose, sided leg of the journey, like the concert tickets, it is very difficult because fraudsters will see that opportunity because it's decentralized. But again, coming back to, I suppose, the overall topic of what we are discussing today is if you centralize that in the core of a system with access control and so on, and you're sitting on the fundamental transaction, which is the invoice between the buyer and the supplier, or the exporter in the case of Wells Fargo's Global Invoice Connect, sending the invoice to the supplier, you have essentially a closed loop. So the more you can, I suppose, centralize that around the core transaction, the more you can mitigate the fraud. There's always inherent risk of fraud, no matter what, but it boils down to, how do you mitigate against that? And I think the more that you close the loop in terms of connecting both parties within the one platform, that's where digitalization really excels.
It's a bit like we talked about earlier, right? I mean, it's really that intersection between the payment and the information. So, did I get the concert tickets? That's a piece of information, right? If I receive them in a digital format in the app that the company produces, and once that receipt is confirmed, I originate the payment, which is real time. I'm closing out that transaction, to Sinead's point, in a closed loop environment, right? But without the information and the payment being sort of consolidated in that closed loop fashion, you lose that orientation.
And I think one part of the information to all of that is it comes back to the earlier question around smarter payments. I've talked to a number of corporates that, they'll pay their Facebook or Google ads bills on the spot, right? They won't think about it because they have the information. They're sending it to a trusted supplier. They know if there's any reconciliation issues, they have someone they can contact and work with. Rather, if they're sending payment to a brand new supplier that they're doing business with the first time, maybe they want to do a card because then the liability is held on the networks and they have that recourse. And so I think when I think about, or when we talk to customers and the way our customers think about it and how corporates are thinking about fraud, to what Judd and Sinead were saying, having the closed loop of information, that's absolutely critical and absolutely important. But then it's also taking a bit more of a surgical strike to how you want to go about paying them, in the sense that maybe there's a category of vendors that, you'll pay night and day real-time payments, right? Then there's another category of vendors that, let's maybe slow roll it a little bit. Let's use some of the legacy methods and go that route. And so that's where some of the smarter payments aspects come in. It's if you're doing a bank transfer, maybe one sort of one vendor's is one way and another vendor's is another way.
Got it. I think that makes sense. It's having choice, right? It's having systems that provide those options and that choice. I'm watching our time, and we're almost up against it. But I wanted to get one final thought from each of you. So we've talked a lot about the pain points and the opportunity for digital to really make a difference in how payments are managed, how payments are embedded, how they can actually expedite and streamline the efficient nature of business operations. How do you see the landscape evolving, though, over the next 12 months? New players, new entrants, consolidation, new trends. I mean, is it just the continuation of what we saw in 2020, or will there be new things that will be introduced into the market, into the consideration set in 2021? I know it's only day 5, but do you guys have any thoughts? Jed, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think we'll continue to see very innovative partnerships, right? That will be an ongoing trend, no doubt. But I think we'll start to see a more aggressive understanding and therefore evolution of the pain points in the core of the financial services infrastructure, right? I mentioned earlier SWIFT, who is that interconnection for correspondent banking around 10,000 plus banks worldwide, is recognizing the amount of friction that exists in the traditional cross-border space. So you look at the SWIFT Simple programs and the SWIFT Instant programs that have the ambition of interconnecting the SWIFT network with local real-time schemes, right, from a cross-border perspective, or Simple, which brings more certainty of principle in SLAs around timing. Those are all rails that are ubiquitous and available to everybody's benefit, right? Not just banks, but the way that fintechs develop solutions, it's going to afford a whole nother layer of alternatives to innovate off of, and potentially significantly reduce, perhaps not realized in 2021, but significantly reduce over time as the iterations occur, some of that.
Joe, we lost the very last point that you said. Could you repeat that? It sounded very insightful, but we lost it.
Sorry about that. No, I was just saying that I think some of those innovations we'll see at the overall industry level will start to ease some of that friction, right? And those are services and capabilities available to everybody, right? So I think they will actually further incubate innovation in the fintech market as much as in the financial services market.
Sinead, how do you read the 2021 tea leaves, and specifically, your place within it?
Yeah, and I suppose on behalf of Transmate, when we set out, when Technology Group set out in 2020 or 2010 to actually build a network, up to 2018, we'd built all of the network into the OECD. You see us building it down into South America now and into the wider Asia group. And what that means is what we're doing is establishing greater reach for all of our global partners, our existing partners, but our net new partners. And again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, what we want to be is the infrastructure inside powering the digitalization of the embedded platforms. And that's what we want to concentrate on. So from our point of view, we will continue on the journey that we've always been on in terms of, establishing greater reach right deep down into exotic locations outside of the OECD areas. But what that will provide is, an element of real-time enrichment of the payment capability, not just payment, but also collections. And as Scott was saying on the Global Invoice Connect, this is not just about payments. This is about supplier intellect and understanding, the cash flow cycle of the overseas collections as well. What we're doing with Wells Fargo is more so on the collection side than more so what we're doing with Coupa Pay, which is on the payable side. But again, expanding the network so that ultimately our partners can benefit and their customers underneath from enriched data and immediate information.
Ravi, I'll give you the last word. Your take on 2021 and where you see some of the innovation trending.
Yeah, I look at it as a multifold thing. I think there's going to be continued consolidation within fintechs this year. We saw some of that last year. I think there's even some that happened today. So I think that's going to continue. To Judd's point, the partnerships are going to continue. At this point, all the banks are partnering with a number of fintechs. Those partnerships are coming to fruition every day. I think the interesting thing is how many of those partnerships will actually bear results,
Right.
Which is getting back into what are corporates willing to do and not do right now. And I think what we're going to see from a corporate standpoint is a lot of corporates have had pent up demand or pent up demand in terms of not quite sure what was going to happen in 2020. We have a little bit more clarity going into 2021. So we expect to see some of that pent up demand kind of open up. And I think the last thing from a Coupa standpoint is, we've been on this mission as a broader company strategic initiative around community. And community for us is really leveraging the data and building the infrastructure and building the ability for our customers, our suppliers, our partners to have access to that community data such that we can make smarter decisions, whether it's around payments or purchasing decisions, invoicing decisions. So we're going to continue down that path, and that is a multi-year journey that we're on, but we're going to start to see some of that play out in a lot of these topics that we discussed today.
Well, I think all of you will be very busy if, in fact, only 3% of the business payment flows are digital. So there'll be lots to do, lots of opportunity to innovate, lots of opportunity to bring new ways of streamlining business payments cross-border in particular in new and more meaningful ways. So I thank you all for your insights today, Judd, Sinead, and Ravi. You guys lived up to my opening build up. I think lots of new insights and perspectives on the business payments challenges you guys shared. I appreciate that. Thanks to all of you who gave us your time today. Happy New Year, and I hope all of you stay safe and well and have a great one. Thank you very much. Goodbye now.
Thank you.
Likewise, Karen. Thank you.